So, Jonathan, I'm thinking I'm going to come down to London in a couple of weeks.
Oh, good.
Just to be brave, just to get out of Oxford.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in will you come into the office? Well,
the office is closed. I'll just come out to London, see anyone who's willing to see me from a distance, maybe pop into Parliament. And then
yeah, well, you can pop in. You can pop in here.
Yeah, come and see your new place, and then sort of go home feeling like a triumphant explorer.
Yeah.
I'm gonna start broadcasting now to give the audience.
Okay, shall I keep my WhatsApp on for you to send me questions in
case any come in?
In case, heaven forbid, it goes wrong.
Yes.
Cool. I should have said this before, but I'm not going to do job titles. I'm just going to do affiliations. I hope no one's offended by that. I find it so weird not being able to see the audience. Can't. I mean, the reason I put a tie on is just to remind myself that there is an audience. Form of self-discipline.
I haven't got a beard either.
Well, actually, this is turning into a thing now, because this is partly stubborn spite, because I said to Nicola, I'm not getting rid of it till I can go to a barber's. It's starting to irritate me now, so I'm not quite sure. Okay, we're live. I think we'll give it another minute. Watch these numbers, and when they stop ticking upwards, or when it's on the dot. Let's give it another 30 seconds and then kick off. I don't know if you people can see the questions we've had in. The first one's about my tie. Decide which of you wants to take that one. Okay, I think we might as well start now, because we only have an hour, and we've got a good number of audience members here already. Welcome everyone to the next in our series of Isolation Insight events. You'll all be aware that the ONS put out its figures for GDP in the last month this morning, and we've got a fantastic panel to talk about the economic situation arising both from COVID and from Brexit, and maybe discussing what interlinkages there may be between them. I'm sure I don't really need to introduce our panel, but I'll just say quickly in the order in which they're going to speak. Jonathan Portes from King's College, Meredith Crowley from the University of Cambridge, Gemma Tetlow from the Institute for Government, and Ben Chew from the Independent are our speakers. They're all going to make short statements. We might have a little chat amongst ourselves. We'll see how that goes. But then we're open for question. If you can use the Q&A function, I will try and be semi-competent and pick the questions as they come in once we're done. But without further ado, Jonathan, can I turn to you?
Okay, so as you said, we got the ONS figures today, and I'm going to try and be a bit countercultural. Economics is sometimes referred to as the dismal science. Rather topically, of course, that's because we weren't that keen on slavery. So a badge we should wear with some pride. But what's the good news today? Well, there's two bits of good news. First of all, the fall in GDP of 20% in April, after a fall in 5% in March. That's a total fall of 25%. That is by far the worst in anything, by a very, very long way in recorded history. On the other hand, it's significantly less than was implied by the forecasts made by the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England. So in some sense, we haven't fallen nearly as far as they expected us to. But perhaps more importantly, and better news, the British economy, in my view, is almost certainly growing at the fastest rate ever in recorded history. May will be somewhat higher than April, June will be even higher now. We're really going through what, if you believe that sort of statistics, is an absolutely unprecedented boom. Of course, that doesn't mean anything too much either. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's not so much the fall that matters. We knew there was going to be a huge fall. That was, you didn't need to be an economist or a statistician at the ONS. We know that from looking out our window or walking down the high street. The crucial question is how quickly and how strongly we can recover. And the good news here again is that COVID hasn't really damaged the productive capacity of the economy in any meaningful sense yet. It hasn't destroyed factories. While tragically, tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, the macroeconomic impact of that is essentially zero. So the potential for a strong recovery is there. What could stop it? And my view is that, if we allow this to damage the economy significantly in the medium to long run, that is not the fault of the virus. That is the fault of policy. It's because we've got things wrong. What could go wrong? What could go wrong is if we allow short-term unemployment or furloughing to become long-term unemployment, if we allow good or viable firms to go out of business, if we allow business investment to be permanently hit. And all of these things are potentially susceptible to policy. So what I would say is that the premium on getting economic policy right, both macroeconomic policy, ensuring that demand and supply are roughly in balance as we emerge, and even more importantly, microeconomic policy, support in particular to people is the most important. And there's going to be a really difficult balance here, which is the balance between enabling people to get back to their old jobs, and the furlough scheme has been part of that, but also enabling people to move into new jobs, because some jobs will be destroyed, some jobs won't come back. We need to make sure that people can move into new jobs. Unfortunately, as yet, the government has done a lot more on the former than the latter. And I think that is really the policy priority going forward, is programs for training, for people to move into new jobs, wage subsidies for new jobs. There are some ideas that have been produced by, around the place by the Institute of Employment Studies, for example, for recreating some of the success we had with things like the Future Jobs Fund. And I think that's the sort of area we need to go to. Meredith in particular, I think, is going to focus on the interaction between this and COVID-19. So I won't say anything more just yet. But I think how those interactions work is absolutely crucial. And again, without taking a side at this point on the extension debate, emphasizes that policy is really going to matter, not just for the short-term trajectory of the economy of the next few months, but more as to what sort of economy and how strong an economy we have over the medium or long term. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Can I I don't know if you want to answer this or not, but can you pick a letter of the alphabet for the recovery? V, U, L? I mean, where are you? You were very strongly V early on, weren't you?
I am still broadly optimistic. I am still V. I mean, I think economically, the government has done mostly the right things. I'm less optimistic maybe than I was 3 or 4 weeks ago, because the sort of sense of that the government lacks a strategy, it's incoherent, the whole Cummings thing, insignificant in itself, undermines confidence that these people know what they're doing, quite frankly, or that there's any sort of coherent strategy. But I think that is recoverable. I don't think that anything that's happened so far need lead to permanent economic damage. And I think it's important, actually, Ben will talk about the perception of economics, that we keep on saying this, that if we don't have a V, it's because we got it wrong, because the government got it wrong, because we got policy wrong. It was not an inevitable consequence of the pandemic or the virus. We have to keep on focusing on that. If we get things right, we can see a V-shaped recovery, and we shouldn't be fatalistic about it.
Brilliant, thank you. Meredith?
Sorry. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thanks. So I'll just add a little bit about trade. And so just background points, let's remember that the government's own forecast of what we should expect from Brexit in the long run, so a sort of long run 10-year forecast of what we could expect from a free trade agreement, is about a 4.9% decline in real GDP in the long run. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and Brexit. That's the magnitude of what we were expecting to lose from Brexit in a very long-term horizon. In placing that in context of what's going on with COVID, so Jonathan just kind of gave us a more upbeat, happy spin on the forecast, but the reality is that the forecast for GDP is, outside any historical imaginable number. So the most only comparison we can really make is to the Great Depression. And the technology of that period is so different that it's not really a very useful comparison to people who are alive today. And so we're going to have this decline of real GDP in 2020 of about 11 to 15%. That's enormous. Declines in exports and imports for the UK are, from the OECD, the forecast is somewhere between 16 to 19%. So it's also going to be enormous. If we think about what happened in 2008, 2009, what we call the fourth quarter to fourth quarter comparison. If we compare growth in the second quarter of 2009 to 2008, real GDP in Britain was only down 5%. Real trade for Britain was about down a little less than 15%. So what we're looking at now is considerably more damaging. So, this is to me very depressing, but let's think about what does this mean in terms of what's going to happen with Brexit. So the first thing is that the forecast for declines in trade for this year just from COVID completely dominate any loss we might have expected from Brexit. So I think the reality is that whether we get a very good FTA with the EU, whether we don't, we're still looking at an enormous decline in trade in 2020. And so the growth, from 2021, I think we're still going to be in a weak position. The concern I have at the moment is that if we fail to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, what we're going to see happening because of COVID is there are going to be a lot of businesses closing down in Europe and in the UK. It's the reality. This happens in all recessions. They tend to be businesses that weren't very strong to begin with. So we know that we always lose a lot of firms in recessions. And so what we know about UK trade is in 2013, 2014, 2015, typical years, we have about 20,000 UK firms exporting directly to the EU. And if we look at these firms and how they're finding new clients, these firms are constantly introducing new products. At the same time, they're shutting down some products. So presumably their customers are saying, oh, we don't want that anymore from you. They're switching customers. So what we know happens in recessions is rates of entry decline a lot. So it's going to be much harder for UK firms, even if we have a free trade agreement, to form new relationships. If we throw on top of that an increase in tariffs for selling things into the EU between 3 and 10%, UK firms are going to have a really hard time building their business, continuing their business. So my big concern at the moment is that we're going to have, because the recession is already going to be creating exit by a lot of firms at the product level, and then some firms completely shutting down, all of the existing trade linkages that are firm to firm, we're going to see a significant portion just disappear. And then if in 2021, British firms have to find new suppliers and they have to look for new customers, and they're facing high tariffs and all this customs documentation, they're going to be really, really disadvantaged. And so what I would hope is that we take this into account. The worst time to introduce trade restrictions is during a recession. And one clear example, President Trump introduced trade restrictions between the US and China when the US was in the middle of an economic expansion. This reduced trade, it raised prices, but it really was kind of fine for US employment, and it didn't really make much of a big impact on overall US growth because these trade restrictions came on during an economic expansion. And so if we put on trade restrictions during a recession, that's the worst time to do this. It's actually going to make it very difficult. And where Jonathan's very optimistic and hoping we can have a V-shaped recovery, one of the things that can be a real threat to that and go not to a V and not to a U, but to an L-shaped recovery where things really drag, is going to be introducing additional taxation and additional burdens to British firms.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Gemma, just before I ask you to speak, can I just say what I forgot to say at the start, that in a kind of nod to the X Factor, you can vote, I think, or like the various questions being asked, which will prompt me, I think, because there's already quite a few in. If you all look at the questions and give them a thumbs up if you want me to put them to the panelists, then I'll try and do the most popular ones first. I hate this sort of populism, but on this one occasion, we'll go for it. Gemma, over to you.
Thank you, Anand. So I was asked to say a bit about the exit strategy from the current lockdown, and perhaps sort of set the scene for that is worth thinking back to the lockdown itself and the sorts of what happened and the policies that have been in place since the end of March. So the government deliberately shut down the economy, which, as Jonathan set out, is just an unprecedented thing for the government to do. This is not a recession in any normal sense of the word. This is not a failure of demand in the private sector. This was the government deliberately trying to shut down the economy and stop things from operating. That led to a big fall in economic output, as Jonathan said, and an accompanying unprecedented policy response, which was entirely aimed at mitigating and trying to minimise the sorts of things that Jonathan was talking about. So having shut down the economy, what the government has wanted to try to do is ensure that actually everything stays in place such that when it can come to reopening it again, once the virus is under control, people are still with their employers, businesses are still there, ready to open back up, to ensure that none of that short-term loss of economic output turns into long-term scarring. So people don't end up losing their jobs prematurely and suffering permanent damage to their future earnings potential, and you don't end up losing businesses from the UK economy that have a longer-term future. So government policy since the end of March has been totally focused on trying to basically keep the economy on ice. And that's led the government to do some things that have never happened in the past. So we have the coronavirus job retention scheme, which has the government paying 80% of wages to a quarter of the UK workforce, which is huge. We have the government compensating the self-employed for their profits. We have slightly more generous unemployment benefits, but also wide-ranging loan schemes and guaranteed loans from the government to businesses to try and tide businesses over and ensure that they're still going to be there as we try and reopen the economy as we come out of the coronavirus crisis. So that was an unprecedented kind of challenge for public policy. But in a sense, the lockdown was the easy bit of this. The government didn't want the economy to function and essentially decided to throw as much money at the problem as quickly as possible to try and ensure that that short-term hit didn't turn into long-term damage. And in a sense, in the initial lockdown, there wasn't really a tension between the desire to promote public health and the desire to protect the economy. Given where we were back in March, you could probably argue that letting the virus rip through the economy and not imposing the lockdown would have been bad both for the health of the UK population and for the UK economy in the longer term, because it clearly would have damaged the UK's workforce and everyone else in it. So we're now moving into the phase where the government is starting to think about trying and actually doing opening up of the economy. And this is where the decisions for the government get much more difficult. We start to get to questions about the trade-off between the desire to minimise the spread of coronavirus and minimise the number of people dying from that cause versus a desire to pursue other objectives. And so whilst government policy has been pretty effective in trying to minimise some of the damage caused by the lockdown, they can't do everything. And the longer the lockdown goes on, the more we start to worry about some permanent damage starting to materialise. And that could come through a number of mechanisms. So we worry about the fact that children, particularly more disadvantaged children, are not getting the education that they should have whilst schools are shut down, and the long-term harm that may do to their prospects. We worry about people who are now leaving school and university and going into a non-existent labour market, and evidence from previous recessions suggests that that can have long-term scarring effects on those people's prospects. The government has been very generous in many ways to businesses, but businesses face fixed costs beyond their wage bills, and at the moment most of what they have to fall back on there is just loans. And we know from surveys of businesses that many businesses don't have the cash on hand to keep themselves going for much more than a few months. So the longer the lockdown goes on and the more businesses are not able to operate, the more we might start to worry that businesses that have a post-coronavirus viable future will actually nonetheless shut down because they can't tide themselves over through this medium-term period. So that's kind of the pressure on the government to want to start thinking about reopening the economy and getting things moving again. That becomes more possible as the virus is brought under control, but obviously there's still a lot of unknowns around how quickly the virus transmits, the precise level of prevalence of it in the UK, and how releasing any of the lockdown restrictions might impact on the spread of the disease and the number of people dying from it. So that's the sort of difficult decisions the government is facing. And then alongside that, there are some very difficult decisions for the government about how to adjust public policy at the same time. And as Jonathan said, and I very much agree, this is a really, policy is always important, but it is really, really important now what government policy does and the impact that is going to have on how the economy recovers and what the long-term impacts of this coronavirus crisis are. And so the government is trading off a lot of different things here. So on the one hand, they will want to continue providing support so that people don't unnecessarily lose their jobs if their companies do have longer term futures. On the other hand, and this particularly becomes an issue if we think that the coronavirus crisis has in some way structurally changed the UK economy. So if we think either the ongoing impacts of the risks and dangers caused by infectious diseases mean that some types of behaviours and activities that we used to do, we're not going to do anymore. So if, for example, we for quite a long time don't really want to fly on planes and go on overseas holidays, or no longer want to do as much going to the cinema or going out and socialising in busy places as we did before, if those are sort of long-standing impacts of this crisis, then that may mean that there are some businesses that existed back in February that don't have a long-term future post-coronavirus. If that's the case, then what the government would like to do is to help reallocate all the people who currently work in those businesses and those sectors over to other businesses that have a brighter future. That's a very different type of policy response to the sort of world that Jonathan portrayed, which is very much just a V-shaped recovery back to the world we had pre-coronavirus. If all the businesses that existed in February were going to come back by the end of this year, then the government would simply be thinking about continuing to support those workers and those businesses until they can be back fully functioning as they were before. The difficulty for the government is they don't know quite which world we're in, or indeed which businesses are in one world with no long-term future and which businesses are in the other world of going to come back in the next few months. And that's the real challenge for government in calibrating policy over the next few months and years, is knowing exactly how much of those things are needed, which sectors need what, and doing that in a way that doesn't sort of hinder the economy performing as productively as it could do over the next few years.
Thanks so much, Gemma. And just bear in mind, there are a couple of questions in that sort of speak to that, in the sense as to whether the government shouldn't give this process a steer, particularly with regard to emissions and climate. That is to say, it's not just about picking the firms that you think might have a future, but picking the sorts of sectors that you want to have a future, if at the same time as doing everything else, you want to fundamentally reshape our economy, which of course is an open question, but one we should try and come to. Ben, over to you.
Thanks. So I was asked to look at, do ordinary people understand the issues of the COVID recession and how they interact with no-deal Brexit economics? And I think the short answer is that I suspect not, but I think it is worth looking a bit about why not. So for me, the fundamental problem in explaining the issue around economic impact scenarios is that, in my experience at least, people don't intuitively distinguish between the short term and the long term. So it's still common to hear the claim that the recession predicted after the 2016 Brexit vote, because that never materialized. All warnings from economists about medium and long-term impact of Brexit are all kind of worthless. I'm sure we've all heard that. And I think we see a sort of similar problem here with talking about and thinking about the COVID Brexit interaction. So the short-term impact of Brexit is of course huge. as we've been seeing from the figures, but a V-shaped recovery might or might not materialize. But surely, as Jonathan was saying, the majority of the fall in activity in Q2 will be recovered by the end of the year. Now, what about a no-deal Brexit on top of that? Well, we can't know that it would result in an observable double-dip recession. But even if it's masked, and this is one of the theories which is going around, that it will be masked by the COVID fallout, even if it is masked, the idea that no deal on top would be positive for the economy is, as Meredith was pointing out, complete nonsense. But in a way, in terms of the economic communication of this is kind of beside the point, because the longer term impact of Brexit has always been where the bulk of the projected economic damage has been, not the short term. And I think the job of economic communication is to kind of wrench the debate away from these issues of masking and focus it on the long-term damage of a no-deal Brexit. Related to this is, of course, the question of the counterfactual, so the damage to the UK economy relative to where it would have been otherwise. This is not a very well understood concept by the general public, again, in my experience. And it's extremely hard to communicate verbally to the layperson. So people understand what a fall in economic activity is. They understand the concept of a big recession. Underperformance relative to where the economy would otherwise have been, that's much less intuitive. And that's one of the key challenges, is communicating that. So all that said, what do the public seem to think about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit? Well, there has been some polling commissioned by Best for Britain, Hope Not Hey, showed pretty large majority, 64%, agreeing that with the statement the government should request an extension to the transition period in order to focus properly on the coronavirus. 36% agreed with the contrary statement. The Brexit transition period must end on the 31st of December, whether a deal has been fixed or not. That was from May. And John Curtis, the great John Curtis, has written for You that other polls have shown a similar plurality of support for an extension. But as he also wrote, it does seem to depend on the framing of the question and whether coronavirus is specifically mentioned. And there's also a very strong split on Leave Remain lines. So not much evidence as of yet that Leave voters are rushing to support an extension because of the COVID crisis. Now, that may change as more businesses speak out. We heard Carolyn Fairbairn of the CBI pretty strongly yesterday. As more businesses do so, that may change. Public opinion may shift. So watch this space on that. So is the economics of all this communicated clearly enough? Put it this way, I think there's lots of room for improvement. The communication of the uncertainty in economic model forecasting could and should be better explained, in my view. The truism that all models are wrong is still misinterpreted widely to mean that no model is worth anything. And we now incidentally see epidemiologists suffering something similar, which is not really any kind of consolation. I would like to see less emphasis on specific estimates, down to the decimal point. Thinking here particularly of George Osborne in 2016, saying every UK household would be £4,300 worse off. But also other estimates, sort of suggesting that the economy will be 2.73% lower in 10 years' time than it otherwise would have been. I think round up or round down and emphasize the uncertainty around the bands. Related to this, there's a problem that what politicians say has an inordinate impact on the economic discussion. So when politicians say something, that gets media coverage of the economics of it in a way that it doesn't when an economist says something. I wish I had the answer to this, but I think that is a big part of the problem, especially since we're now starting to hear claims that the costs of no deal are lower than they've ever been. These seem to be the briefing from Downing Street. It suggests that some in government are either exploiting public confusion about things like counterfactuals or being simply confused by it themselves. And this relates to a broader question, the way that economics has been subsumed in culture wars, basically. So it's not what you think about the analysis, it's about which side you're on. And that's something that we really need to face up to when we're trying to think about communicating these issues. Could the economics of Brexit and COVID be better explained? Undoubtedly. But the reality is, I think still, is that there's a section of people who are just not interested in it. It's more about which side are you on, as I was saying. Now that's pretty depressing, but I'll wrap up on a slightly less pessimistic note. That's that, economic calamity forecasts of it have been pretty much hypothetical for the past 4 years since the Brexit vote. but now we've experienced real economic pain because of this COVID emergency. And I think it's an interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure it's true or not, but that now people have experienced something like that, that their willingness to take economic risks may be different, that they may start to put livelihoods and weigh it equally with these issues of identity. I wouldn't bet on that happening, but I also wouldn't bet against it necessarily. And I think that's going to be a very, very important factor when it comes to these issues I've been talking about communicating the economics of all this.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben. I must admit that I sort of had a second look at the 0.4 that the ONS came out with this morning on the end of its figures, thinking, I wonder where that 0.4 comes from. That's very specific. So over to the questions. Well, Nicole Dines, if we were doing this in person, we would give you a mug or a t-shirt or something, because you have asked by far the most popular question, which is, I think this is probably for you, Meredith. I'm not going to ask everyone for each question for the sake of getting through them, but I think this is you, Meredith. It's about today's announcement. It's not an announcement, was it? It was an FT leak, I think, of the idea that the UK will only do soft touch border controls on goods coming from the EU, even if there's no deal. What is the importance and significance of that? And there's another question which is linked to it from Sharon Lander, who asks, I mean, it's a really interesting question, actually, what implication will that have for the GB Northern Ireland border? That is to say, if we're essentially waving things through at Dover, what will the EU do about that in the event that those lorries keep right on going and end up in Northern Ireland? Have you got anything you want to say on that, Meredith?
So I think the first thing is keeping this in context, right? So in context, we're looking at roughly a 20% decline in UK imports. So imports are going to be coming down a lot this year. And so in some sense, it would be easier to manage the border if we have a no deal, because there's not going to be as much stuff moving across the border. Realistically, the EU doesn't have anything to worry about if we wave things through coming into the UK, right? So their concern is about stuff then moving on into Northern Ireland. I think realistically, this is a small quantitative problem from their perspective. That is, they're worried about maybe massive amounts of fraud, but we're not going to see massive amounts of fraud, I think, in the middle of a recession, and even during a pretty, gradual recovery. So I think if you worry about complaints and where complaints might come from, it might be other countries that want to export things to the to the UK. They might be worried about the UK not enforcing its border with the EU, because it puts them at a sort of competitive disadvantage. Again, the reality is that, Canada's not going to be exporting a lot anywhere because of the recession. It's possible that countries like Canada and the US could say, well, the UK is not living up to its WTO obligations because they're still letting stuff in from the EU for free, and they're not giving us that same kind of market access. But I think realistically, what incentive does the EU have to bring complaints about the UK importing things from the EU? It would benefit EU businesses. And so if they were smart, they would just keep their mouths shut and pretend they didn't notice it too much.
Does anyone else desperately want to come in on that? I mean, if not, we'll keep, okay. There's a question from Dominic Walsh, which is it's about, whether you bundle up the pain effectively. That is to say, what the comparative advantage of doing Brexit either with a deal or no deal while we're in mid-corona crisis, because maybe that makes adaptation easier if you're adapting anyway, or trying to delay Brexit by extending transition, not delay Brexit, but delaying leaving transition for a couple of years so you can deal with the two things separately. Is there a strong economic case either way? Any of you?
I think it's a really interesting and complex issue. I don't think it's cut and dried. I think it is not unreasonable to argue, as some people have, perhaps within government, that if you're dealing with two significant structural shocks that require reallocation of labor, changes of business model, some businesses to go out of business and other new businesses to appear, that the cumulative impact of, because there are adjustment costs, actually you minimize the sum of those adjustment costs by handling it all at once. The counter argument is the one that I think Meredith made, which is that actually if the impact of COVID has been to disrupt supply chains and they're going to have to be rebuilt, then overlaying trade barriers on that at the same time as you're trying to rebuild them means that the UK will be shut out of those rebuilt supply chains, and there's force to that. I genuinely do not think that there is an obvious answer, a right answer here, given the nature of the uncertainties and given we don't know quite where we will be in the path of recovery as of November, December.
Gemma, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, the only thing I sort of agree with Jonathan, but I wonder if there's a slight distinction between, for the government and thinking about two big structural shocks to the UK economy and how you adjust policy to navigate through those, versus what things look like for an individual business who may have a certain amount of bandwidth to deal with big uncertainty and big adjustments to their business, and whether some of the demands that would be placed on them on trying to navigate their business through the coronavirus lockdown, and then layering over on top of that the adjustments that they need to get Brexit going, which may well be related to the fact that they may need staff working to put in place the changes needed to prepare for Brexit, at the same time as the coronavirus shock would say that they'd like to furlough those workers because they don't have money coming in the door. I just wonder whether there's perhaps a slight picture that looks slightly different from an individual business level than perhaps it does from a sort of the UK government, which looks at the whole macro picture.
And of course, cynically for the government, there's politics here, and December's far further away from the next election than 2 years from December. So if you want to get the pain in early, then there might be a rationale. Meredith or Ben? Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, can I? Yeah, I think this question is interesting, but obviously, as Jonathan says, there's huge uncertainty about it. We can't know how the two will interact, but this is why I was arguing that it's important and it's useful to distinguish between the short term and the long term. Even if there is some masking, even if there is some perhaps benefit of shaking up industry at the same time, the long term impact of a WTO Brexit does not change because of what happens in what happens this year, next year, the year after. The long-term impact of the long-term negative impact, which is in all the models, is still there. So I think there's a when the government briefs out that the costs of a no-deal Brexit are lower than they have ever been, I think we should be very clear that if that applies at all, it's only to the short term. It does not apply to the long-term costs, and that's what people who are concerned about their livelihoods and living standards well into the future should be concentrating on.
Go on, Meredith.
So I just want to make the point, we've gone through this very expensive furloughing program, which is indebting British children to pay for this, right? And why was that a good plan? Precisely because we think the people who are being furloughed have human capital, that if we don't furlough them and plan to bring them back to their jobs, there's going to be a real loss of capital to the British economy. And so I think actually the furlough program, a lot of people would agree, sort of brilliant in that it was trying to keep, this capital embodied in firms and workers alive during this recession. And so now, to me, it seems like sort of foolhardy to say, okay, well, structural change means businesses have to go. I think if we allow for a no-deal Brexit, we're going to be forcing businesses to close down. And there's going to be a real loss to the economy because all the capital, the intellectual and human capital, the businesses that shut down embody is going to just be permanently destroyed. Now, that's always, this is the nature of an economy. Businesses shut down when they're not doing very well. But I think we don't need to sort of pour fuel onto the fire of trying to, push weak businesses out during this recessionary period. So I do tend to think that, piling shock upon shock, it does have some permanent negative long-term consequences through the loss of the, human capital for people who are not going to easily be able to move into new jobs. So that's a worry for me. And so I'm much more, so I guess I'm more worried about the consequences of a no-deal Brexit right now during a period of like weak economic growth.
But the counter to that is, the reason that furlough is a good idea for some people in some sectors is because those jobs are going to come back and those businesses are going to come back when we reopen. The implication of either a no-deal Brexit or the very thin deal that the government wants is that some firms and trade is going to be unviable. We have no interest in, now you may think that's a bad policy in itself, but if that is government policy, and it clearly is, that's where we're headed anyway. There's no particular gain to be preserving those people and those firms. We just have to get on with the reallocation. I know, that is piling extra pain on now, but that pain is going to happen anyway, and you don't avoid it by keeping people in those businesses, do you? I mean, or even minimize it.
Well, I think actually the thing is, realistically, it's going to be harder for new businesses to form during a recession, right? And so it's harder for new businesses to form. If new businesses can't form and they have a harder time expanding employment, you don't really want a lot of people being laid off at a period when it's hard for new relationships to form. I think it's great if new British businesses start going in new directions, post our relationship with the EU changing. But I think we just have to be careful about, if we want to move people into new jobs, we need a business climate and an environmental time when it's easy for new businesses to enter. And a recession is not that easy to do that.
I'm going to call this a score draw for the moment, and we're going to just move on. Gary Franklin's asked a question to which, I don't know whether you want to speculate, but it's essentially about whether or not we can, as of now, start to think about the relationship between the timing of lockdown and the ultimate economic impacts. The question is, it's done in terms of blame, the question, which I don't particularly want to drag you down that route, but, can you speculate now about, had lockdown happened a week or 10 days earlier than it did, what economically would be different now? Our relative emergence from lockdown relative to our closest competitors would obviously be around the same time. I think that makes a difference. But is there anything else that can be said about how the government handled this in terms of timing a response to the public health crisis and how it relates to economic outcomes now? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just throw out, I think there's one of my colleagues at Cambridge, Giancarlo Corsetti, has written an interesting analysis of the US economy and the timing of its lockdown and how lockdown is structured. And, the key point of his analysis is a lockdown that protects by forcing a lot of people into their homes. There were some key workers who have continued to work throughout this whole recession. So, logistics firms, drivers, police, fire, and they kept some core activity of the economy viable. And so in some sense, kind of making a lot of us who are sort of peripheral to core activities of the economy sit home, and do our academic work in our offices or write our newspaper articles in our offices. By not having us around to share disease, we were able to keep the health of core sectors of the economy quite strong. So he would argue in his paper, he's discussing that actually it was really important to have a lockdown. It was really important to shelter the health of key workers in the economy, because that allowed some key activities in the economy to go forward. I think it's a little bit unfair for us to complain a lot about, should the lockdown have been a week earlier, should it have been a week later. I think the real problem, that seems to have been critical, is that we didn't have a good public health infrastructure to assess people's illness early on. And so I think, one of the difficulties was, relative to some other countries like Germany, we didn't have a lot of great information about how widespread the disease was in the early days. That was a problem. So I'm a little bit reluctant to second guess the way the government acted on some information those early days, because it seems like they didn't have great information about the prevalence of the disease. Now, why they didn't have the information is something that I think we should be criticizing, which is there should have been more investment in the public health infrastructure earlier. I think, so hopefully in the future we'll have that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, in the sense that delaying the lockdown by a week almost certainly cost a large number of lives. We know that now. Whether that was the government's fault or the scientists' fault, or just because this is all uncertain, it's not our place to decide that. But I don't see that delaying the lockdown by a week has any significant economic impact at all. Really, it just needs another, shifts by a week the date, the timing of that very large fall in GDP. In the long run, that makes absolutely no difference to anything. What does make a difference is whether the government has a coherent strategy coming out of the lockdown. And here, I think Meredith's absolutely right. It's the complete incoherence and failure on things like test and trace, which delays the viability of unlocking the lockdown on the one hand, and also means that people's business and consumer confidence in going back to normal just isn't there, because people don't think the government has a grip. They're not sure whether they're going to be safe. So that failure means both that unlocking is slower than it need be, and that it's less effective because people have less confidence in it. And that seems to me far more damaging in terms of the recovery and the economy than the initial timing of the lockdown.
And
yeah, just similarly to that, I would say that it's probably worth distinguishing between the depth of the recession, the depth of the hit, and the length of the pain. You know, looking at some of the OECD analysis this week, it seems that the countries which are projected to have a big hit have similar structural features. So in that sense, if you're going to have a lockdown, the UK would have always had a large hit. On the timing, though, I mean, it's interesting to look at some countries like New Zealand. They went in relatively early, took action relatively quickly, and therefore the argument is that they will have a smaller economic hit because they'll be able to come out of it quicker. If the UK had lockdown earlier, perhaps we could have got on top of the disease earlier, therefore we would have been able to ease the lockdown sooner. So the depth might have been the same, the peak to trough, but the duration of it might have been lower. And I think that might be a useful way to address the thought in the question.
thank you. Anyone else want to come on that? Tom Breaks partly answered his own question, I think, with giving the answer I would have given. But the question is, which sectors of the UK economy that haven't been badly affected by COVID will be most heavily impacted by Brexit? And he suggests food, which is what I would have said. But any takers on this? Meredith, you can't tell by this whether I'm staring.
Yeah, no, I guess so I think one of the things, so when we have a recession and we have a loss of or loss of consumer confidence, durables get hit a lot. And so we have a lot of damage to washing machines, automobiles. And I think, from the UK's perspective, transportation equipment is something that's very much at risk with Brexit. But that sector is being hit by both shocks. For food, of course, food demand is constant. And the question is going to be exactly, to what extent is no deal Brexit going to, impact us on the import side or the export side? I think actually my overall impression of the food sector is it's been brilliantly effective at continuing to get us our imports throughout the whole COVID crisis. And so, we've never had a real lack of fresh produce, and this is coming in from all over the world. So some of these logistical supply chains have worked very well. A lot of, fresh produce comes in via airplane. Air travel's been hit. The cost of moving, cargo by air has increased 30% globally. So I've been quite impressed with how well the whole food sector has responded. And as much as there's been this issue of trying to get things that are generally going to restaurants into the consumer supply chain, I've been quite impressed with how available food has been. So I think that sector has responded to the challenges of the crisis quite well.
But it's quite vulnerable to particularly a no-deal Brexit, just because of the disruption that will cause on entry, assuming we do some checks. Sorry, Jonathan, do you want to come in? You're muted.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, no, nothing to add. Okay.
Anyone want to add anything on this? I'm not sure we've come up with another sector, Tom.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go on, Gemma.
I mean, the only one that I'm sort of puzzling over is sort of financial and business services, which I think to a large degree haven't been affected by coronavirus, in the sense that those are sectors that are very easy to work from home and carry on. I mean, they haven't been entirely unaffected, because obviously the demand for some of those services depends on other businesses in the economy operating, and some of that has fallen away. I guess I'm slightly pausing because my understanding of the evidence how those sectors might be affected by Brexit is that it's quite hard to know, in the sense that we don't, we know less about how services sectors are likely to be affected by Brexit and exactly how those sectors may be able to work their ways around the fact that we may not have services deal with the EU, and whether there are alternative approaches to getting professional qualifications recognised and that sort of thing. So that's why I'm slightly pausing on, I think we know less about what the Brexit impact on those sectors is likely to be, in a way that on the good side we have much better information.
So I should take advantage of that segue to say we did put out a report on Brexit and services this very week, which you can read to learn all about that. But Ben, were you wanting to?
Yeah, I was just really going to make the point that if you look at some of the ONS analysis, it's astonishing how broad the impact of the lockdown has been. You know, pretty much every sector apart from supermarkets and health has been hit incredibly hard. So in that sense, the premise of the question, I don't know, I just think you probably should go back to the original analysis of how Brexit hits sectors and kind of remove it from the COVID impact question.
Brilliant, thanks. Now, the next one is from Steve Thomas, and there are several like this, and this is about reprioritizing, if you like, that, you know, should we move beyond thinking and focusing solely on growth and focus on other things like sustainability? I hope you don't mind, Steve. I paraphrase a bit. I suppose I would see this as, you know, do we have an opportunity here to repurpose our economy for some of the challenges that we're going to need to face coming forward, the most striking of which is the climate crisis? Is that something you think is practical? Is that something that you think is politically feasible at the moment?
So shall I start?
Yeah.
So I agree that growth and GDP is not everything, and economists can, I think, slightly unfairly be portrayed as only caring about the size of the economy and GDP. But I think we shouldn't understate the extent to which it does matter. Clearly, as economies have grown and incomes have increased over long periods of time, people's quality of life has got better. And whilst we have had a 20% fall in GDP in the last month, 25% since the start of the coronavirus crisis, I think we should be aware of the fact that actually most people have not felt that 20% fall. We have the government paying people's wages so their incomes have not fallen anything like what would be experienced if we actually had a permanent 20 to 25% hit to the size of the UK economy. So I think we could do more to think about long-term environmental sustainability, and clearly our ability to have high quality of life in future and future generations will be worse if we don't protect the environment. And I think probably many people may have learnt some things about what they prioritise in life and what improves their well-being through the lockdown period, some of which maybe to realise that they really did like going to the pub quite a lot, or may have realised that actually having time, not having to commute, some of those things might improve your well-being beyond just the income that you get. But I think we shouldn't go too far in thinking that, well, we've experienced a 25% hit to GDP, we shouldn't worry so much about getting that back. We should just focus on other objectives. I think that would need to be a bit careful of kind of saying that GDP doesn't matter at all.
Does anyone else want to come in? I mean, it's a normative question as much as anything else, isn't it? Should the government use this opportunity when it controls so much of the economy to try and repurpose it to address climate objectives as well now, rather than what it might have traditionally done?
And I think the answer is as Gemma said, yes. I mean, you know, and this sort of relates to the Brexit thing a bit, actually. If you're going through you have a big structural shock, you might as well try and build back better. So I think that there is an argument here that this does at least create the space. Since you are being forced to have, at least temporarily, a very large expansion of government spending and government interference in the economy, and the provision of capital directly to businesses, the direct support of particular jobs, you might as well use that to do things that you think are going to be in the long run best interest of the economy and society. I think that, you know, that does make sense. It's not, but that is easy to say and a lot harder to do, and we don't have time to discuss exactly how you do that. I think Gemma, though, is absolutely right. I do not see this as undermining the idea that GDP matters at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. The fact is that had we not provided an awful lot of income support for an awful lot of many people, there would be incredible hardship in the UK at the moment. Absolutely, you know, and there are people going, there are children going hungry who shouldn't be going hungry. That is happening now. But it is happening a lot less because we're providing income support to people, and you need GDP to be able to do that. And I think it's, you know, it would be quite the wrong message to think that that GDP, among other measures, isn't a pretty, how much we actually make and produce isn't really important to our welfare.
Ben?
Yeah, obviously building back better, I don't think anyone would disagree with that, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on. I think you have to be slightly careful in how you frame these things, because, you know, the question is sort of saying, as if GDP goes down and people aren't any worse off, well, you know, if you had a 20% pay cut in this, having been furloughed, you are worse off. If you've lost your job, you're obviously worse off. If you've seen a business that you've built over many years, its future in jeopardy, you're worse off. So you have to be cognizant that GDP and the economy really do matter. It's not, you can't just sort of say, well, it doesn't matter, we just rebuild back better. That's not a way to bring people with you, I would suggest.
I do wonder whether it might be in the interest of some to frame this as a sort of part of the culture war, you know, climate versus getting people back to work. But anyway, Meredith.
So just add on to this. I think if you suddenly put on a bunch of regulations that said, okay, well, now we're going to require you to have more, you know, heat efficient windows in your businesses, etc. Now's not a time to add more cost to businesses in, you know, in terms of more regulation, but it might be a time, because during recessions, businesses don't have the available resources to make a lot of investment. However, interest rates are really low. So there's sort of some scope for, you know, government support to try to get businesses to adopt new green technologies. Now might be a time where, you know, government subsidized loan, government can borrow really, really cheaply right now. They could then go, you know, try to help firms, you know, either through big tax incentives to invest in new green technologies. Now might be a good time, because if you take out a loan to put in some new environmental technology, it's relatively cheap in terms of the interest cost of any kind of loan you need to take out. So there's a, you know, again, this goes back to like, what is GDP? Well, GDP is also investment in new technologies that help the environment and, you know, reduce carbon footprints.
And I suppose government can also shape consumer behaviour. I mean, whether you want to encourage people to buy electric cars going forward, if you want to try and restart the car industry, for instance. I mean, there are all sorts of ways.
Cash for clunkers is always a big, you know, get out of a recession policy. Let's buy out those old, dirty, polluting, you know, cars, and you buy something more efficient.
Yeah,
it helps.
It's a very specific question from David Knott, which is, have there been any estimates of the impact on productivity of COVID on a sector by sector basis?
So I certainly haven't seen any, but I think it is an interesting question. And I was sort of looking at the question, sort of pondering what might have happened. And I'm sort of torn between thinking, in some ways it may have got worse. So if you are a restaurant or a shop, there's a serious risk that you may have a more labour-intensive business model in future, because you can't get as many customers into your shop or into your restaurant if you have to maintain social distancing. On the other hand, I wonder whether there are certainly sectors where the sudden need to work from home has really pushed the adoption of technology that's been quite slow to be adopted. And I think we've certainly seen that within government, that civil service has suddenly adopted a lot of new technology and is making much more reliance on digital online services that perhaps hadn't sort of picked up in quite the way you might have expected, given the technology was already there. So I wonder whether there are areas where it might have boosted productivity, because it's been a bit of a shock to try out new technologies.
I think this is a really interesting and important question, and of course, you know, we don't know the answer yet, because we don't know what the new normal, the new regulatory framework will be for a lot of businesses. So, you know, if we have 2 meter social distancing versus 1 meter social distancing versus a vaccine or other eradication of the pandemic that means we don't have to worry about social distancing, those will have quite different effects on productivity in shops and restaurants. I mean, I think the sort of, you know, the headline figures we have so far suggests that productivity hasn't obviously been affected that much, in the simple sense that if you look at the statistics, it's not obvious that that for those of us who are working, it's not obvious that there's a huge difference in productivity. But that may just be a measurement thing, in the sense that I think the 20% fall in output that we saw in April is probably roughly corresponds to the fall in labor inputs. So there's no big obvious change, but that may just be a measurement thing. And maybe as we explore more, we'll get an idea of some of the effects that Gemma is talking about, of whether we're being more or less efficient working from home, for example.
If no one else, I'm going to slightly subvert the system here, because there's a question that I'm interested in and I think is important, which is about whether or not, what the impact of the economic outcome of COVID will be on inequality. It's a question from Daniel Burnham saying, can a recovery reduce the inequality gap? Well, all the data I've seen on the impact to date has been one of reinforcing the inequality gap rather than reducing it. But I don't know what your thoughts are about going forward. I suppose it's partly a political question, isn't it? It's partly about whether all these clapping sessions and you know, recognition of the role of frontline workers will actually translate into public policy down the line. Who wants to kick us off? You're all looking keen.
But the first thing is, you know, the loss of education to young people and the negative impact on, you know, people graduating, university students, but across the board, I think the permanent long-term impact is going to be an increase in inequality, because we've had all these children, especially children in lower income groups, you know, being permanently hit by their loss of educational opportunity. And, you know, there's going to need to be a very concerted effort to try to help close that education gap, which I think is going to scar, you know, a generation. So I think that's the first extremely depressing thing. I mean, there's also service sector workers who have lost their jobs. Oftentimes, you know, these are young people in poorly paid jobs, and those jobs have dried up. And so, you know, they're financially disadvantaged now. They've lost, you know, they're going to, you know, eventually this thing will end and they're going to be trying to look for new jobs. But would you rather have someone who had a job and then lost their job, or would you just hire somebody fresh out of school? And so I think there could be some more, you know, the loss of opportunities to build up your resume as a young person, especially for people in the service sector, you know, in low skilled jobs. This is going to be very damaging for them, and it's going to be hard.
Jonathan.
Just going back to what I said before, I mean, it's possible that the impact on inequality will be negative in the long run, but that will be our fault, not the virus's fault. The virus clearly has, because of the way our society is organized, hit disproportionately. I mean, the ONS published some stuff today about who's dying of the virus, and the socioeconomic gradient is huge. And as we also know, the ethnicity gradient is also huge. So it's hugely unequal in its incidence. But going forward, that doesn't need to be the case. I mean, a lot more, you know, the World War II hit poorer people more in lots of respects. The East End was bombed a lot more heavily than the west of London. But the aftermath of World War II, the policy response meant that inequality was hugely reduced in this country. So there's nothing that means we have to allow inequality to rise as a result of the virus. If we do, it will be our own fault.
I'm afraid I've let this run over slightly, which I promised not to do. But actually, if the panelists can stay on, because we're going to try and retreat back to the green room so I can thank you in person. It might not work, but if it doesn't, I'll email you, but let's see if that works. But thanks to everyone for joining us. It's always been on my bucket list to chair an economics seminar, because it would make me feel very clever and technical, and now I've done it. And a tribute to our four speakers is the fact that I think I pretty much understood everything that was said. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being so clear. And thank you for such a really interesting session to all of you. Have a good rest of the day and have a good weekend when it comes. Thank you.